And we're going to continue on with an ongoing story that we began last week. I described it as a story within a story within a story. Obviously, we're reading in the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel story of Jesus. That's the biggest story. And then along the way, we get this story about this father who comes to Jesus asking for help. But then within the story is another story of a woman that confronts Jesus. And last week we looked in detail at it. It's going to be sort of Mark's pattern to do this, to give us a story within a story. We're going to see it even in the next chapter that we turn to. But in this story, we are brought to terms with two very desperate groups of people. Right? One's a father who's taking the cause of his sick and dying daughter, up with Jesus, and then another was this grown woman who came to Jesus asking for help. And both of them are called daughters. Jesus calls the woman who had the issue of the hemorrhage of blood discharge for 12 years. He calls her daughter. And obviously this other man, this ruler of the synagogue, is he's petitioning that Jesus would help his daughter. So what we have here is two daughters in distress. So they're not just damsels in distress. Actually, there's a translation out there that calls these gals damsels. So they're damsels in distress, and they're also daughters in distress. And this week we're going to take up actually the first one, because the story begins with the first daughter in distress. But the bigger purpose, just so we can keep our eye on it, is that we would walk away from all these stories and we would have a similar response. And that's Mark's goal in recounting the gospel of Jesus, is to put you right there in a room where it's happening, in the space where you can see the action adventure right in front of you of Jesus' ministry, to see it, almost to touch it, to smell it, to feel it, so that you might walk away and have the same reaction as the actual eyewitnesses. What was their reaction? Are you picking this up? What was their reaction? Fear. Some other words for similar. Reverence. Awe. I mean, they're freaked out, we could say in our modern terms. Right? They're trembling. They're astonished. They're amazed. They marvel. They wonder. They ask themselves questions. And that's Mark's purpose. If you are following along and if you're hearing it, then you're going to do the same thing. And he wants to tell it in such a way, so intensely, that you would also bow the knee and receive Jesus. Receive this miracle worker. And some saw everything, and they utterly rejected Jesus. They either utterly rejected him and planned out how they can kill him, or they started to come up with some way that they could actually dismiss what they just saw in front of them. Jesus is seeing the latter happen more and more during this last stretch of his great Galilean ministry. People becoming more and more blind, more and more deaf to what they see and hear, more and more indifferent at his signs and wonders, because they're being influenced by the Jewish established leadership of the time, who say, no, this is not the Messiah. Those miracles he's doing, those are actually demonic things, and you got to stay away from this guy. And so they're starting to say, that couldn't just have happened. I couldn't have actually seen what I saw. I couldn't have actually heard what I heard. And guess what's happening? Right? When you begin to not trust your eyes anymore and not trust your ears anymore, then you are becoming blind. Something can happen right in front of you and right? You can't receive it. You can hear something and right? And Jesus says, this generation, they keep on seeking these signs and wonders, but when they get them, they don't believe it. And that's why he says it's just like what Isaiah experienced. Your people who are seeing, you keep on seeing, but you can't perceive it. Your people who keep on hearing, but you don't hear it. You don't understand. And so the purpose of each one of these stories that I'm relating to you, right? This is not a novel thing. We're meeting together to think about these stories. I'm not coming up with them each week. You've likely already heard them many, many times. But the purpose is that each time you hear them, what are you doing with them? Mark has told so many stories, amazing, marvelous stories by this time. Jesus is teaching with authority in Capernaum. The people walk away marveling. Jesus casts out a demon from a man in the synagogue, and everyone is amazed. Jesus restores a paralytic man who restores his ability to walk. People are just amazed. He commands the wind to stop and the sea to become still. His disciples are more afraid of him than they ever were of the storm. He commands thousands of demons to come out of a man. And those demons enter pigs and rush into the sea and kill all the pigs. Last week, a woman was healed from a 12-year-long illness like that. When the people encounter Jesus doing these things, witnessing them, they walked away amazed, filled with awesome reverential fear, a wonder so intense that they had to do something about it. They had to respond. And so where are you at? What do you do with the stories when you hear them? Do you just walk away? No, I don't have time. I don't have time to fit that in to my life right now. There's all these things going on. Or maybe you hear these stories and feel like nursery rhymes, Aesop's fables. I can write good stories too. There might be many reasons why you hear these stories and either reject them or just look for ways not to receive them. Maybe these words are so sharp, but the preacher makes them dull. Great stories, boring preacher. It's my fault. Or maybe Mark's words are mine, or are sharp, and maybe I've allowed them to be sharp too, but you just don't believe them. Right? This is like TV. I've seen enough movies. Okay, fine. But I got real life to live. And maybe Mark's words are sharp, and maybe I've been able to make them sharp too, but your heart blunts the edge of them so much. And maybe it's just because you got other things on your mind, other worries, other pressures, even this morning. Right? Maybe you're here physically, or virtually. But when you hear about this woman, this little girl, you're like, gosh, I got things to do. I got things to do. And you can't even have a second to let these seeds of faith just plant themselves. I can relate to that. Being so exhausted with keeping up with the pressures of life. Or maybe you're just sitting there and some of the pressures of life are that you are angry. Maybe something's happened this week where someone mistreated you. Maybe someone mistreated you years ago. Maybe 12 years ago. Like this lady. But man, is it real today? And so real that your mind has trouble shaking it. And so the result is you have trouble hearing these stories. I'm saying them or reading them, and you can't see them, you can't hear them because there's something else going on. Maybe it's been going on for years, right? Maybe you've been sitting through sermons or reading your Bible or listening to friends' encouragements for years, and it's just like blocked. Won't make its way through. And you can't figure out why. And I think you want to know peace. I think that you'd love to know peace. Maybe finally there's some way to make it through. Well, I want you to ask you this. This is a little thought experiment. If this is you, if I'm describing you right now, what would it take? Or if I gave you the opportunity, if I had this power to give you the opportunity where you could snap your fingers and everything wrong in your life could be right now. What would right look like? What is it that you would change? What is it? If you could be king for a day, and you could mold the world to your liking, what would be different? More time? More energy? More money? How about better relationships? More vacations? Wow, that sounds great. You know, you're telling me a story, but if you could actually give me more time, more money, I'd be interested. Right? Here's the trick, though. I think everyone hears those things and be like, wow, that would be nice. If I could snap my fingers, and yeah, I would totally change. So many things. But here's the problem with all that. Whatever world is on the other end of that snap of the fingers, whatever is on the end of that king for a day design, guess what's still in the world? Sin is in the world. And your new reality inevitably will be just as messed up as the one before it. Just give it enough time, you'll be right back there. The pressures of life, trouble with relationships. And it's not just sin in the world and sin in other people, it's sin in your own heart. And so Mark's message is not, hey, Jesus can snap his fingers for you and give you those things. He could give you more money. He could give you more time. He could give you better relationships. That's not Mark's message. Mark's message is that there is only one person who can change the whole thing around. That he can actually deal with sin and bring a conclusion to it. He can bring a conclusion to sin in the world. He can bring a conclusion to sin in your heart. And here's the point. The only way that you can actually begin to know peace is to come to heaven. He's aiming to show you that there is one person who can calm natural phenomena, calm the sea, calm the wind. There's one person who can do that. He's aiming to tell you about a demon-crazed person out of his mind and someone who encountered him and suddenly was in his right mind. One person. He wants to tell you about a woman who was terrorized by illness for 12 years. And in one encounter with this person, she was healed. And he tells her, go in peace. She's not experienced peace in over a decade. One encounter with Jesus. And not only that, but that Jesus actually has the power to reverse death. So he's better than being a genie that gives you 3 wishes. He's better than someone who can make you king for a day and have you plan out the world or design it according to your wishes. He wants to change everything about you to bring you into a relationship with him. And so I want you to hear this story as an encounter, your encounter this morning with Jesus. And I thought, even if we were to hear this story, I think the way that Mark intends it, it's almost designed to bring you healing. Right? Just like this woman who encountered Jesus, walked away healed. Right? She'd spent all of her money to see all of the physicians available, and they've only made it worse. And she expends her last energy to just get to Jesus and walks away. Do you see what I'm saying? Mark wants to let you into the same crowd with Jesus that was true that day. And for whatever it is in your life that's plaguing you, that's making it so that you can't hear or you can't see, he wants that to be taken completely away. And for you to see Jesus as he is and walk away in full faith, healed. You got it? Let's try to hear it that way today. So Mark 5, and we're going to begin in verse 21. It's in your bulletin. We're going to read all the way to verse 43, and I'll fill in the gap of the passage we read last week. If you're using the Pew Bible, it's on page 789. 789. And here's what we read there. Mark 5, verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, so that is they left the side where the gathering demoniac was. And when he got to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him. And he was beside the sea. And then came one of the rulers of the synagogue. Wow. Jairus by name. And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And you remember that as he was on his way with him, that last week, in verse 25, we began a short story within a story, because there was a woman
who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. And she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power had gone from him, immediately turned about the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" Maybe in a booming voice like that. He didn't have one of these, right? But people heard him. And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And then verse 35, back to the first daughter in distress. While he was still speaking with the other daughter, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with them, and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Wow. Right? Are you amazed? Jesus raised this girl from the dead. Remember the sequence of events that began way back in Mark chapter 4, right? This has been we've been working up to this, because in Mark chapter 4, we are reminded about these constant crowds, constant needs, constant urgency. Jesus has been teaching all day, and remember, he was teaching them in parables, and at the end of the day, he says to his disciples, who are probably thinking about getting off work and going to get something to eat or something, "Hey, let's go to the other side." What? To the, okay. They spend the whole night on the boat. That's where they encounter this storm, and Jesus calms the storm. They get to the other side, and as soon as they get there, there's another problem. This demon-crazed man has been living in the tombs. He comes up to Jesus and says, What have I been doing to you, Jesus? Why are you here? Are you coming to torment me?" Cast out this demon into the pigs, and then the people come from the town. "Get out of here, Jesus. You killed all of our pigs." Get back in the boat. Come back to the other side. As soon as he gets there, there's another crowd. This is just a picture of this continual crowd that is the character of the great Galilean ministry. Just listen to some of these notes from the next chapter. When they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. It's like the circus come to town. As soon as Jesus rolls in, there's a crowd. Or how about this? Jesus attempting to transition to training his disciples, he says to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." And it says, for many were coming and going, and they didn't even have an opportunity to eat. Right? You ever been there at work? It's a busy day. You can't even take a lunch break. That was like the character of walking around with Jesus. They won't even give him a break for lunch. In verse 35, we see that the report of Jairus comes while Jesus is saying, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." He can't even get done with one person before the other situation changes. You got it? How can you keep it all straight? I think most people, probably all of us in the room, know the pressure and the stress that comes with multitasking. Jesus is going to help the one, and then this lady touches him. Okay, now I gotta deal with this. And then over here, Jairus is getting an update. What's going on? And here's the contrast of what's happening. I wonder if I can try this. I didn't practice this. Hope it isn't. Can I get Pastor Jake, can I get you as a volunteer? And Stan, can I give, oh great. Here's how this contrast sounds. You read that first line slowly now.
Daughter,
your daughter is dead. You get it? At the same time, someone's saying, Jesus is saying, daughter, your faith has made you well. Over here, they're saying, your daughter is dead. Daughter, your faith has made you is dead. One daughter made well, while the other daughter dead. Thank you. Go in peace to one daughter. Why trouble Jesus any longer to another daughter? What's the use? Now, she's dead. She's dead. Good for you. My daughter's dead. Maybe because of you. Slowed it down. We could have been there. You got it? Jesus, though, he overhears what's happening over here while he's talking to someone here. He's got an ear out for trouble while he's making well over here. Suddenly, the person who had achieved first place in line and the attention of Jesus, suddenly, he doesn't even know why he's in line anymore. Jesus, it just doesn't matter anymore. Jesus, though, overheard the counsel of the messengers from Jairus' house, counsel that communicates that there's no more use, that the situation is beyond remedy, even for Jesus. And what's the use? He doesn't need to come anymore. But Jesus having heard the counsel for himself, contradicts it. And he asks the man who had enough faith to come and get him to believe a little bit longer. He says, keep on believing. You have faith to come and get me. Have enough faith to keep leading me to your house. And he says, stop being afraid. So not just stop fearing, stop being afraid. Not just don't fear, stop fearing. He's already afraid. Stop being afraid and resolve it with faith. Keep on believing. Right? On this journey, Jesus isn't just urging him to just hold on to a feeling by telling him to don't stop believing. There's a truth that the man has heard, and he's come to believe that Jesus can work miracles. And from that faith, he comes to get Jesus. Jesus has rescued the poor, given freedom to prisoners. He's given sight to the blind. He rescues the oppressed, and he's doing it forever. And he's been doing that for others. He can do it for you too, Yairus. He can do it for your daughter. He can heal her of her disease. He can even give her life again. And at this point, that has actually happened. Jesus came into a town called Nain before this. And he came into town while a funeral procession was going on. And he saw the man being even lifted out, taken out of town to be buried. And he touches him and raises him to life. Yairus, he's heard that story, likely. He did it for him. Could he do it for my daughter? We see the principle here that fear is resolved by faith. Right? Fear isn't just something to be drowned out with some kind of sedative or just thinking nice thoughts, right? Little chicken soup for the soul. No, fear is resolved by faith. Jesus comes and he gives a second opinion on the diagnosis. When Jesus enters the house, he sees that the morning customs have already begun. And there's a loud commotion, people weeping and wailing, and Mark adds the adverb, loudly. Right? He doesn't just come in and there's people who are sullen and discouraged, despairing. Right? They're blabbering loudly. They're in deep mourning. And he comes in and he gives a new diagnosis. No. The child's not dead. She's sleeping. How are we supposed to understand this? Were they all wrong? Have they mistaken a coma or the child being unconscious as death? Was she really just sleeping, merely sleeping? Right? We could say that this culture knows what dead people look like. They probably know what dead people look like more than we do, because people in our culture die mostly in hospitals. That's not always the case. But we try to separate it. For them, it's happening all around them. They know what dead people look like. I think it's fair to say that they knew that this child was dead. The crowd also begins to mock him and laugh at his diagnosis. Who does this guy think that he is? She's not dead? Okay. Mr. Expert, right? Maybe in our terms they would say this guy doesn't believe in science, right? They would say maybe he's not even wearing a mask, right? Who's this guy, right? We know what dead people look like. Jesus comes in and says, she's not dead. Or maybe in the words of Princess Bride, was Jesus just saying that she's just mostly dead, not all dead? Here's what I think is going on. I think we can look at the story of Jesus raising Lazarus for a lot of help here. Do you remember that story from John chapter 11? Jesus says to his disciples, he says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I'm going to awaken him. And remember what his disciples say? Jesus, if he's fallen asleep, he's going to wake up. We don't need to go way up there to wake him up. And then Jesus responds plainly and says, Lazarus is dead. Got it? Lazarus is dead. The diagnosis, Lazarus has died, is the exact same word that the messengers give to Jairus. Your daughter has died. Same words. In that case, Jesus felt the liberality to describe those whose death was not final as sleeping. And in this case, right, the messengers have come with the same diagnosis, but Jesus, aware of what he's about to do, is likewise able that the child is only sleeping in a similar way. Now, he knows that in this case, this girl's death is not final. He's going to bring her back. So she's dead. She died. This little girl, they were right, and Jesus was more right. Maybe we could say that he had alternative facts. Jesus does something interesting, that he picks a select audience. Right? We've been seeing that Jesus is beginning to intentionally spend more time with his disciples and intentionally try to draw himself away from the crowds. And he does that by limiting those who get to stay in the room. He sends away all the mourners except for the girl's parents and takes with him from his disciples only 3, Peter, James, and John. This is an interesting little group. He tends to take these 3 with him to special events that not everyone gets to go to. In a couple chapters, we'll encounter the Transfiguration, and guess who's the disciples who get to go with him? Peter, James, and John. There seems to be some kind of special intention to pour into these 3 specifically. And then he just takes their parents. And at the close of the whole event, he strictly charges them, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone what you've seen. That's different, very different from the beginning of his great gospel, great Galilean ministry, where he's doing all things publicly, widely, for everyone to know. And now he's saying, don't tell anyone. And partly it's just the reason he wants to fit in lunch every here and there, right? The crowds have become so oppressive, they can't even move about. And there's not the opportunity to actually spread the message. At work in Jesus at this time is a number of things. What could be motivating him besides just dealing with the crowds? He's always in obedience to the will of his Father. When God the Father directs him to say, don't say a word, he tells people, don't say a word. The preeminence of his message over the marvels. He's not just seeking to put out great fireworks to show people, but to call people to preparation for a coming kingdom. Has a desire to especially train his disciples. But it's his heart of compassion as Israel's righteous shepherd that's motivating him. Here's the point. At this point in his great Galilean ministry, he doesn't need any more signs and wonders. He's already given enough to demonstrate and prove that his words are true. We see his compassion at every step of this miracle. We see his compassion in the way that he overhears the news that the girl has died, and he immediately encourages the father. Don't stop believing. Don't be overcome with fear. He cares for the family by sending the commotion out of their home. Right? He walks into the home. He sees grieving parents. He tells these people, okay, just you can go. He allows the father and mother to be present with their daughter to see the miracle. And he awakens the child with tender words. Little girl, arise. And Mark even gives us the words. Right? Do you see how he says, Talitha Kumi, little girl, arise. We get to hear the precious words that actually came out of Jesus' mouth in that room. And then finally, he recognizes that the girl would be hungry. He even thinks about that detail. His thoughtfulness about this little girl's state after this miracle, and he helps the parents move from marvel to ministry. Right? They would have been astonished and fearing, and like maybe a shepherd at a funeral, when people don't know what to do. Right? You ever been at a funeral and people are just they move really slowly? Partly because it's like, am I supposed to sit down or stand up? Should I be over here now? And then the person who's leading the event just tenderly comes in and just helps people move along. How do they go on after this event? He moves them from marvel to ministry. And the miracle itself, it's interesting. We're not told anything about why this girl died. What was wrong with her? How did a 12-year-old girl die? We don't know. We don't know what was wrong. We don't know what was fixed to make it right. All we know is Jesus' words to come in and say, little girl, arise from death to life. And clearly she was alive because she got up, walked around, and she even ate food. Dead people don't do those things. This was a miracle. I step back from this story, and last week I said we have to step back from these stories and just ask why. Why do we hear about them? Why did Mark choose to tell us? There's some really interesting things for us to think about. That the ruler of the synagogue is interrupted by a woman who is likely banned from the synagogue by him. Think about that? The one who rules the synagogue, he's the one who sets the rules for the community. Who can gather together? Guess what? He probably marked her off the list long ago. But tragedies on his side and ongoing tragedy on her side, have brought them side by side in front of Jesus, asking for help. At that point, it doesn't really matter what's wrong with her. 12 years. If you think about it, it's a really interesting detail. She's been suffering for how long? 12 years. And how old is this little girl that's on the deathbed? 12 years old. It's as if This man, seeing 12 years pass before his eyes, all the investment, all the care poured into this little girl, suddenly at risk to go right down the drain. And maybe for just one moment, he just catches a glimpse what this other woman's whole life has been like for 12 years. 12 lost years. 12 years of disappointment, of discouragement, of sadness is at stake for him. And he's standing right by the woman who's experienced just that, and maybe partly at his hands. We have this story because it helps us to appreciate the rest of the stories. And it will even help us to appreciate what is coming next. You'd think that after all of these miraculous stories that people would just be lining up to bow the knee to Jesus. Especially people who know him well and who experienced this for years and years and years, like people in his hometown. And next week we'll consider whether that's true. These women, the parents, they both meet fear with faith. And last, as opposed to the established Jewish leadership, Jesus is the real deal. He's the only one who's walking into a boat amidst a storm and calming the sea. He's the only one who's walking into a Gentile town and causing demons to come out of a man. He's the only one that's coming into Capernaum, healing a woman that's been hurting for 12 years and raising people to life. Right? None of the other Pharisees or scribes or Sadducees, none of them are doing that. Guess who should be first in line to bow the knee and use their influence to help people bow the knee to Jesus? The leaders. And so Jesus' compassion is met equally by his anger at the way that the leaders will not bow the knee and point to Jesus. And we're going to see that over and over again. What do we do with this? Like so many stories, are you seeing and hearing what Jesus has done so that you might also marvel with reverential fear? Maybe today, I'm just asking, as the story was read, did you see it? Did you hear it? Were you able to marvel at a little girl brought back to life? Maybe did you see yourself in a similar trial? Maybe something you're going through right now and wondering, what am I going to do? Just like this man who saw his daughter on the death. What am I going to do? And what was the answer? Faith meeting fear. Faith enough to come to Jesus. Faith enough to hear Jesus and to lead Jesus back to the house. Faith enough to stay with him and to stop fear with faith. As a church, we want to be ready to meet people like this. We want to meet one another in ways that we're like this. We also want to be meeting people outside of our church who are in the presence of such struggles, such pressures of life, and to lead them to Jesus. We want to meet this type of woman, maybe even this week. This type of man, this type of child this week with the message of the gospel. And maybe if you're visiting, maybe if you're on the Zoom visiting, or you'll hear this recording down the road at some point. I just want to ask you if you can relate to anyone in the story. Anyone lost in the story, if you can relate to that person. Can you see their need, your need, and theirs?
And would you be willing to be convinced that Jesus could radically change your life? The message of the scripture is that it's a trustworthy statement that Jesus Christ came in the world to save sinners. That's the truth. And if you're here today and you'd like someone to pray with you, there's lots of people who would love to pray with you, just to talk to you about a spiritual need. We'd love to do that. Let's pray together. Father, we come to you. We come to you in awe that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. He met people who were in such despairing situations of life. A daughter who's dying, a woman who's at her ropes and the end of her rope and about to give up on life. And you met each one of them in fear and trembling, and you inspired faith to believe. And thank you that you demonstrated too that your power is greater than death, so that we can even entrust our whole souls, our whole lives to you. And would you cause each one of us, whether on Zoom or in the room, that in the pressures of life, the trials that we're faced, that we ought to turn to you, not to try to figure it out on our own this week, but to bow the knee and to ask Jesus for help. And this larger message that Mark is after to show us what it is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Would you equip us even for ministry this week with this story? We might even tell it in a way that draws people close, to tell of a man who was in such despair that he sought Jesus for help and Jesus answered. Would you help us to tell of this man's faith even this week and use it as a gospel witness that draws other people to you? It's in your name we pray. Amen.